Привіт, мене звати Наталка Гуменюк, а тут зі мною
Ангеліна Каріакіна.
І ми зараз розповімо, про що буде розмова в наступній серії подкасту «Коли все має значення» з Джонатаном Літтелом, письменником, істориком, журналістом і не тільки. Як би можна описати Джонатана? Якось, мені здається, дуже вузько його називати просто журналістом-письменником.
Мені здається, що в якийсь певний період свого життя він був справжнім авантюристом. Я, коли готувалася там до першої зустрічі з ним, я почитала його біографію, почитала ще кілька його важливих робіт і просто поставила себе на його місце і зрозуміла, що я не у всіх би ситуаціях, напевно, ризикувала так, як ризикував він. Що я маю на увазі? Літтел, ми його знаємо в Україні в першу чергу як автора роману «Благоволительки» про Голокост, де головним героєм виступає офіцер СС. Події цього роману розгортаються в тому числі на території України, там Східної Європи. Але Літтел багато часу провів в Чечні в складі гуманітарної місії під час Першої Чеченської війни і Другої Чеченської війни. А потім, у 2012 році, йому спала дуже крута думка поїхати в Сирію і висвітлювати події в Сирії. Тоді дуже-дуже активним ще на той момент був спротив Башару Асаду. Цей рух, революція, бойові дії, він хотів висвітлювати це. Власне, так народилась його робота «Зошити з Хомса». На жаль, я не знайшла перекладеною українською цю книгу, але вона є російською, десь викладено онлайн. Ця книжка, я от буквально нещодавно читала її, розповідає про те, як він добирався через там мінні поля, через блокпости з Лівану в Сирію, щоб потрапити в місто Хомс і звідти розповідати про цей рух за звільнення з Сирії проти авторитарного диктатора Башара Асада і звірства, які там чинилися в Сирії. Тобто письменник, ми його трошки інакше собі уявляємо, і роботу письменника, ніж те, що робив Літтел. Я буквально перед випуском, перед нашою розмовою в подкасті питала його, де він ще був в Україні, крім Києва. Він їздив в Харків, він був в Бучі і говорив зі свідками воєнних злочинів, а потім, очевидно, розуміючи моє питання, сказав, що він більше на такі авантюри не підписується, він не в тому віці, щоб кудись там прориватися, готувати такі матеріали, по суті, журналістські, репортерські, але це дійсно була ризикована подорож.
Але я хочу просто, щоб ти також розповіла трошки про свій фільм і те, яке є ваше знайомство, ваш спільний інтерес з Джонатаном. Чому, власне, ти з ним говорила, оце поєднання Сирії і Чечні?
Я працюю над документальним фільмом про російські воєнні злочини в Україні, в першу чергу, і порівнюю їх з ними в Чечні і в Сирії. В моєму фокусі 3 міста – Маріуполь, Алеппо і Грозний. Йдеться в першу чергу про бомбардування, ракетні удари по пологових будинках. Літтел провів в Чечні, як я вже казала, доволі багато часу в складі гуманітарної місії, і я з ним зустрілась для того, щоб просто поговорити, як виглядали ті часи. Я минулого року шукала активно свідків серед чеченців, серед чеченських лікарів, шукала колишніх чеченських вагітних, щоб вони могли розказати ці історії, і звернулася в тому числі до нього, тому що в нього дійсно велика кількість знайомих серед правозахисників, серед журналістів, і ми з ним тоді про це поговорили. А далі він сказав мені, так ніби між словом, почувши, що я готую, що в нього є цікавий відеоархів, який йому по дружбі свого часу передав російський журналіст Андрей Babitsky, якого наше покоління могло знати за його репортажами для Радіо Свобода з Чечні. Унікальний кейс його в тому, що його свого часу поміняли російські федеральні війська на чеченських військових, і це дійсно був якийсь такий нечуваний кейс. Але в якийсь момент, коли Росія анексувала Крим, є таке хороше українське слово «поплавило», Андрія Бабіцького поплавило. Він підтримав анексію Крима, потім пізніше переїхав в Донецьк, де він, власне, і помер. Після цього Літтел не спілкувався з Бабіцьким, і йому, насправді, от як він розказав, мені було би цікаво дізнатися взагалі його мотивацію, і поговорити з ним про те, що сталося. Але ці відеоматеріали – це дійсно унікальні плівки. Мене цікавив саме 99-й рік, коли відбувся масований удар по Грозному, по центральному ринку, пологовому будинку єдиному, який працював в Грозному, і мечеті. Була величезна кількість загиблих. І от, власне, цю картину 99-го року через оптику Бабіцького я змогла побачити завдяки Літелу. Мені здається, дуже важливо, знаєш, ще сказати одну річ. Ми про це не говорили з Літелом, але це очевидне питання, яке, напевно, є і в слухачів. Просто це була не тема нашої розмови. І мені, чесно скажу, маю на це право, менше цікаво було про це говорити, але довкола його роману «Благоволительки» був певний резонанс в Україні. Він відмовився видавати цю книгу з певними передмовою або післямовою українських істориків з українським поглядом на події Другої світової війни. Ми з ним коротко про це поговорили після нашої розмови, коли я вже його проводжала. Я його перепитала, чи дійсно це так. Він сказав, так, це було моє рішення. Я не хотів, щоб хтось писав передмову або післяслово.
Я додам, я пам'ятаю доволі добре цей скандал в той момент, коли цей роман, який отримав величезну кількість нагород, але, звісно, в силу того, що події відбуваються в Україні, для деяких українських істориків і людей, можливо, є чутливість, тому що там йдеться також про те, що деякі українці були співучасниками злочинів під час Другої світової війни. І було побажання, аби український історик розказав свою версію правильної історії. Мені здається, що це трошечки дивно, коли ти пишеш книжку художню на якихось документах, а тобі кажуть, а давай ми додамо ще когось, хто з тобою не згоден, і це вийде в твоїй книжці.
Так, цю позицію можна зрозуміти. Власне, ми з ним говорили про одну зі сцен, яка є на початку книги, де цей його головний герой, есесівець, приїжджає у Львів, і, я, власне, Літелу сказала, що це ніби, це художня література, і там сцена, як двоє львів'ян, здається, біжуть за єврейською жінкою, б'ють її в живіт, і це настільки детально описана сцена, що ти, коли її читаєш, тобі здається, що ти бачиш прям кадри цього. І він каже, що це книжка художня, але я писав її з кадрів історичних, які він бачив на кінохроніці. Да? Зрозуміло, що там не були Ми пам'ятаємо ці кадри, в тому числі з фільму «Лозниці» про Бабyn Яр, і, власне, частина критики і резонанс довкола цього роману був ще тому, що він вийшов у видавництві Бабиного Яру. Да? Ми пам'ятаємо резонанс і дискусії довкола взагалі цього проекту, який фінансував російський бізнесмен Фрідман і керував ним росіянин Хрижановський. Але, зрештою, неможливо не згадати про це, розповідаючи про розмову з Літелом. Ми з ним про це детально не говорили. Він готується до публікації своєї наступної книги, в якій в тому числі розповідається про воєнні злочини в Бучі. І я дуже сподіваюся, що вона вийде українською мовою в першу чергу і першою справою вийде в Україні.
Я не чула розмову, дуже хочу її послухати, але я здогадуюсь про одну тему, яка не могла винирнути. Я хочу, щоб ти там теж пояснила, про що буде ця розмова. Але ми часто говоримо, що російська війна стала можливою через безкарність росіян, зокрема там в Сирії, в Чечні. Частіше Сирія нам зрозуміла, про Чечню ми насправді не так багато знаємо. Через вік, через те, що це було далеко і дуже багато всього сталося в Чечні. Але Джонатан ще говорить багато про байдужість і те, що зробило не так російське суспільство. Мене дуже зачепила ця його думка, про яку він пише в статтях, які, зокрема, перекладаються і російською, які він скеровує, я так розумію, для своїх колишніх або друзів, або знайомих.
Так, справді він минулого року зробив навіть такий відкритий публічний заклик, звернення до своїх російських колишніх чи теперішніх знайомих, російських лібералів, російської інтелігенції, щоб прийшов час їм, я зараз перефразовую, звісно, але влаштувати або вийти, так би мовити, метафорично чи не метафорично на свій Майдан. Він сам в цій розмові сказав, що це була трошки наївна думка, це були перші тижні війни великої і вторгнення, і він емоційно відреагував на це і звернувся таким чином до росіян. Мені не хотілося, щоб ця розмова фокусувалася на росіянах і на тому, що робити росіянам, але це неминуча розмова, неминуче питання, тому що Те, що сталося в Чечні, сталося в тому числі через реакцію і через те, як з цим жило російське громадянське суспільство, як висвітлювалася ця війна в російських медіа. Ми зараз не говоримо про Нову газету або там Ехо Москви, такі, скажімо, в порівнянні з великими російськими медіа, такі, можна сказати, бульбашкові навіть, да, медіаресурси. І ми дійсно з ним про це говорили, про відповідальність російської інтелігенції за те, що Росія проковтнула воєнні злочини в Чечні. Можливо, ймовірно, за те, що ми тепер спостерігаємо другий цикл цих воєнних злочинів. Ми також про це говорили. Але, звісно, мені також було цікаво почути, що він думає про Захід, про те, що робити з Росією Заходу. Він також, крім заклику до російської інтелігенції, він публікував не раз заклик до Заходу до посилених санкцій, до того, щоб дітей, близьких, наближених до Росії режиму виключали там з університетів, ізолювали від західного світу. Водночас, теж такий маленький спойлер до цієї розмови, він вважає, що багато росіян, талановитих, працьовитих, в тому числі дуже добре освічених, наприклад, айтішників, які виїхали на Захід, їм краще лежатися там, щоб не стати ресурсом для Росії всередині країни і не слугувати не лише там гарматним м'ясом, але й не слугувати в першу чергу інтелектуальним ресурсом для цього страшного режиму. Власне, про багато речей ми говоримо, в тому числі і про плівки Бабіцького, я його запитала, і про самого Бабіцького. Ми поговорили і про Сирію. Знову ж таки, він був там, так, він бачив на власні очі, перш ніж в кампанію вступили активно росіяни, російська авіація. Він бачив, що відбувається в першу чергу на рівні людей. Мені здається, розмова вийшла цікава, і я дуже сподіваюся, що вона зайде, так би мовити, нашим слухачам.
Тому пропоную послухати розмову Ліни Карякіної з письменником, журналістом і просто надзвичайно цікавою людиною для світу Джонатаном Літтелом.
Jonathan, thanks so much for doing this and for talking to me. Also for all your help with the movie about Mariupol, Aleppo, and Grozny. I wanted to start maybe with a question that doesn't seem to make much sense now, but I kind of think about it quite often. You know what Russia is about. You've seen what Russia is doing in Chechnya, in Syria. Probably you've been following what they've been doing in Georgia as well. You were here in Ukraine shortly before the invasion. Did you expect something like this to really happen?
It's a complicated question. I mean, obviously I didn't have any particular information other than what was in the press. I did take the American warnings very seriously because I felt the way the Americans started putting out these warnings in October of 2021 was actually rather unusual for them. And there was something about it that made me think this is serious. This is not propaganda. This is not play acting. They actually have concrete information. So as the months went by and the warnings got more and more concrete, more and more precise, I was tending to think that, yes, something like that was going to happen. I think the one thing I would say, perhaps, I actually did also work in Georgia. So I've seen the Russians in Chechnya and in Georgia. I did not see them in Syria because I was there before they came. But there was always in the back of my mind the idea that their behavior in those conflicts was the way they behaved towards foreign people they considered, Chorny Zhope or Arabs, Muslims, whatever, and that therefore inferior people in their point of view that could be humiliated, tortured, murdered at will without any problems. And I assumed that with their so-called Slavian brothers, they would behave a little bit better. But clearly, as we saw extremely rapidly, once they entered the country, this was absolutely not the case. They behaved exactly in the same way with the Ukrainian civilians or the Ukrainian military that they captured, that they had previously behaved with Syrians, Georgians, Chechens, everything. So I think the level of barbarity that they exercised on their close neighbor, that their whole entire propaganda is claiming are their brothers, their sisters, that long-lost part of their own country was rather surprising. But then if you think about it analytically and you look at also just the way they behave inside their country among themselves, I guess that makes it a lot less surprising because, of course, even within Russian society, they exert this degree of violence and brutality on their own people. So why shouldn't they do it on foreign people? I mean, I think it's very much something in the nature of current Russian society, this level of violence that's permeating it at all levels. And that comes out in the most hideous forms whenever they go to war against anybody.
Well, actually, that was my question. You've seen what they were doing to the civilians in Chechnya. You think that is an order, a tactic, or just the way they are?
I think it's both. I think it works at all levels. I think at some levels, it's very much a decision that's coming from command level. You know, like when to conduct a zachistka, for example, a commander doesn't need to particularly be precise. He just says, do a zachistka, and everybody knows what that means and knows that they're going to be killing people and torturing people and capturing them and so forth, because this is just constitutive of the way they do things. In some of my pieces and in the book I just finished, where I wrote a lot about Bucha, you know, I drew on testimony that comes from, for instance, either testimony of Russian prisoners or radio intercepts, telephone intercepts, in which it's quite clear that in many cases commanders will say things like, you know, let's go fuck up some civilians, let's go kill some civilians. So, I mean, there's definitely a very large part of it which is command in certain occasions. In other occasions, it can be just pure initiative of the local soldiers, because this command structure and the way it functions creates such a, I would say, permissive environment for crimes. And it's quite, of course, understood that soldiers are welcome to loot anything they want. They can rape at will if they want to. You know, that's just part of sort of the bonuses that they get on top of their salary, so to speak, that you then get hideous levels of just purely criminal violence, which is not driven by command, which is just soldiers either getting drunk and going out of control or just having, quote-unquote, fun in their own terms. We saw many examples of this in Bucha. You know, I talked to a family that found the corpse of a young woman in their pagreb, who was kept there as basically a sex slave for several days and then was murdered. You know, this I don't think comes from a command order. I think there's just a bunch of soldiers grabbed a girl and had fun with her and killed her, because that's what you do in the Russian army. Examples of drunken guys breaking into houses to steal alcohol and murdering people and so forth and so forth. So it really functions at every level, I would say, from the lowest soldier all the way up through command. Obviously, when you look at the career of a man like Surovikin, you know, who's known as the Butcher of Aleppo, you rise in the command chain through demonstrating brutality. I mean, that's how you rise in the Russian army. That's how you get better positions. The more brutal you are, the more destructive, the more efficient in their terms, the higher you rise. So the culture of violence literally goes from the lowest soldier all the way to the senior-most commanders. And I think this is very much a built-in, pretty much philosophy of the Russian army, which is the exact opposite, of course, of the philosophy of Western armies, of NATO armies, where soldiers are taught and trained to limit civilian casualties as much as possible, to limit collateral damage. It happens, of course, but the general philosophy is to limit it, not just for ethical reasons, I should add, but for very pragmatic reasons, because having fought all these insurgency wars, the Americans or the British, for example, know very well that the more civilians you kill, the more people are going to take guns and come at you. You know, you're just creating new soldiers with every new enemies, with every civilian you kill. So they try to restrain this type of, you know, individual violence for also very pragmatic reasons.
Yeah, but isn't that also because in democracies, the army is sort of under the eye of the society, of the civil society, the free press, you know, the human rights activists, and basically the whole world, right? The concept of impunity for the Russian soldiers is like probably the reason why they're doing this over and over again. There is no one literally in this world who ever, like, they always were able to get away with this. There was nobody to ask them, you know, for justice. Isn't that the case for Russia? I mean, this is my next question about the Russian civil society. You were friends with many Russian, like, independent journalists, liberal activists, journalists, opposition, whatever. We call them the Russian liberals, the good Russians, as we also call them. In Ukraine, it's almost a meme now. Do you think they did something wrong after Chechnya to, like, the Russians were able to get away with this in Chechnya? Now they're doing this over and over in Ukraine because they never get to answer to anyone, including Russian press and civil society, which existed at that point?
It's a very complicated question, and it's you have to look at different periods of time. In the first war, there was an incredibly active civil society movement against the war. I'm thinking, for instance, of the demonstrations that Nemtsov conducted at several points against the war, which were, there were literally 1 million people on some of these demonstrations. NTV was extremely critical of the war and was constantly showing very critical footage, criticizing the government, criticizing the army. Obviously, the way the government and the army saw this was just like, these fucking civilians are preventing us from doing our job correctly. And if we lost the war, it's probably their fault. Which, incidentally, by the way, is how a lot of American military and government figures felt about Vietnam, that the reason they lost Vietnam is because they were undermined by American civil society and American press, which is why they did their best to keep it under control in Afghanistan and Iraq, which was the next war they fought, to make sure that that wouldn't happen again. So I would say this is not exclusive to Russia. It's quite a general reflex of most armies. Even here in Ukraine, for instance, right now, your government is keeping an extremely tight control over the press, over what the press can report. And it's not only for strategic reasons, it's also to control the narrative. But to get back to the Russians, which is what we're talking about. So in the first war, yes, there was every level, you would say, of protest, which did very much undermine, in many ways, the effectiveness of the war and I would say contributed to the defeat, Russian military in 1996. But obviously, when they started the second war under Putin, they made sure that this was not going to happen again. So one of the first things Putin did when he came to power was take control of the televisions. He took, NTV away from Guzinsky. He took the televisions away from Berezovsky. So to make sure that at least on the level of the televisions, the narratives would be completely under control. They didn't really care at that time about things like Novaya Gazeta or Echo Moskvy because so few people were reading or listening to it that it really just didn't matter. But the general narrative in terms of what the entire country was getting as information was quite rapidly put under control. And so there was much more of a passivity at the beginning of the second war, helped also by the fact that a lot of people believed that indeed the Chechens had committed these terrorist acts in Moscow when they blew up the buildings in September 1999. Obviously, some people don't believe it's the Chechens. Some people believe it's the FSB who created a provocation. But the mass of Russian people accepted the story that the Chechens had done this, had murdered Russian civilians in Moscow and other places. So that contributed also to, I would say, an acceptance of the necessity of the war. So it's already a very different situation from the first war. The human rights activists, the people like the activists from Memorial, the activists from, Novaya Gazeta, just think of Anna Polikovskaya, for example. These people remained intensely active and intensely critical, as long as they were alive and able to work. Several of them were murdered for this, starting with Anna. But it's true that in the more general society, among, say, the Moscow intelligentsia, there was an apathy during the second war. I can't compare with the first war because the first war I was only in Chechnya. I was never in Moscow. So I did not interact with people in Moscow during the first war.
No, in one of your texts, you recall on the parties that you
That was
had.
the second war. That was at the beginning of the second war.
Okay, and some of your friends saying that, stop annoying us with your Chechnya.
Yeah, exactly.
You're saying that's not my Chechnya, it's your Chechnya.
Exactly.
Actually.
There was already a huge apathy developing in society, faced with Putin, faced with this war. That, the whole idea was let's just make money and ignore this and be happy, which is obviously something the regime was pushing and is still pushing today. That basically, they're trying to, even now, faced with this war in Ukraine, they're still trying to make sure the Moscow intelligentsia can hang out with free Wi-Fi and beanbags in Bar Gorkova and chill out with their children and drink beers and ignore everything that's going on. That's been their strategy ever since Putin's been in power, I would say, to make sure that people just don't care about what's going on.
How about Crimea? Isn't that not only about people not caring, but people accepting and supporting what is happening, and probably some part of the people also among the Russian liberals?
Very clearly. I was not in Russia at that time, so I have no personal experience of the nuances of this support. But, clearly we saw there was massive popular support for the annexation of Crimea, as illegal as it was. The only case I would know was one of my publishers who was very much what we in Europe would consider right-wing, although that term doesn't really mean anything in Russia. And he was very much in favor of the annexation of Crimea and of Donbass and was quite enthusiastic about all this. But he's the only example I know personally. Most of my friends, again, didn't really care. I'm talking, when I say my friends, I mean my normal, ordinary friends, not the human rights defenders. Obviously, in the human rights community and the activist community, people were horrified. But again, that is such an incredible minority of the population and even the intelligentsia that their voice really didn't count for much. But yeah, of course, we all saw the groundswell of public support for Putin, the mass enthusiasm. Karim Nash was incredibly strong in society.
We really want to find a way what the Russian civil society needs to do now in their country. But still, without this question, it's hard to imagine how we can defeat Russia, without any movement from within, inside Russia. You made this public address to the Russian opposition, liberals, some time ago, saying that they need to do sort of their own Maidan or whatever it is. Do you think this is ever possible, given what is happening in Russia now, knowing how many Russians left actually Russia and they're not there anymore, and with all that is taking place in Russia, with all the arrests, and all that oppressive machine? Do you think this ever may happen?
Honestly, no. I mean, I wrote my piece the second week of the war, and I think I was quite emotional when I wrote it. And looking back at it, it was pretty naive, actually. Even then, I should have understood that none of this was ever going to happen. Yes, I mean, Russian civil society has been systematically and scientifically destroyed by Putin. It's been fragmented. The dangerous figures and voices have been sent to jail. Most have left. A few people have stayed, but are completely isolated and can only do individual activities. I'll give you the example, for instance, my very dear friend Oleg Orlov, who's one of the senior leaders of Memorial, who's currently on trial for violating all kinds of laws. He's been doing single protests. So he goes out on Red Square in front of the Kremlin and holds up signs saying, 1945, Russia is the conqueror of fascism, and 2023, Russia is conquered by fascism. I mean, this type of thing, which is very incredibly courageous and will lead him to jail. But he's alone. I mean, they can't even have two people because this is forbidden. The Putin regime has been incredibly successful. Back in 2012, 2011, they were very scared of the intelligentsia, of the crowds, of Bolotnaya. They created the Nashi to actually literally counter them physically in the street, preparing for an eventual Maidan-type scenario that they would have their own kids that would go fight in the streets. Mm-hmm. So they were quite scared of this scenario. Today, it's absolutely impossible. The best we can expect now, I think, would be localized demonstrations or possibly even popular uprisings in the regions that would be linked to either massive increases in the cost of living, the cost of basic necessities, of food products, or new mass mobilization that would specifically affect, more peripheral regions, and that could create localized disturbances. But again, they will contain them on the local level, and they will never spread in such a way that they can unite and work off each other, because there's no one to do that. There's no one to coordinate. There's no one to... And the Putin regime has made extremely sure that anybody that could coordinate such things, such as the Navalny people, have been either kicked out or put in jail. So there's just literally nobody left.
You were not only addressing your speech, your text to the Russians, you were also asking the West to do certain things, like keep on the sanctions against, the Russian government and their kids and their families. Do you think that was naive, or at a certain point it is working? What do you think about it? I mean, this tactics of pressure against the Russian establishment outside Russia.
No, that I don't think is naive at all. I think that's a very effective tactic. I think the main problem is it's not applied nearly on the scale it should be. They've sanctioned hundreds of government officials and their families, but they should be sanctioning thousands, actually. So the sanctions should be the targeted individual sanctions, in my opinion, should be much, much, much broader than they are. I mean, the entire presidential administration should be sanctioned, the entire Duma and everybody who works in the Duma. They should be really broad individual sanctions that would affect the entire Putin elite. I'm very much in favor of that. There are many loopholes in the sanctions. We, in Europe, we're slowly learning that we're still buying gas from Russia, which is just completely obscene. Liquid gas, we're no longer buying pipeline gas, now we're buying liquid gas. We're not doing nearly enough to close the sanction loopholes through the third countries. So, a NATO member like Turkey is still a conduit for all sorts of prohibited goods to Russia. But I think the tighter the squeeze on the Russian economy, the better.
How about Russian culture and Russian presence, in the civilized world? All the possible movie, literature, art festivals, and the place that the Russians used to have there and now. Do you think this should be somehow revised? You probably know and you probably see the Ukrainian reaction toward that. Many Ukrainians refuse to take part and participate in events to share the floor with the Russians, which is absolutely understandable. But what do you think about this?
I can certainly understand it. I personally don't have the mentality of a policeman, so I don't think it's up to me to say who's good, who's bad, who should, who shouldn't. And in terms of individuals, I think in terms of culture, the rule of thumb should be extremely simple. If people have denounced the war and denounced the regime and oppose it, they should be allowed to continue to work. If they are standing with the regime and, in favor of the war or keeping silent, then they should not be allowed to work in the West. I think that's a fairly straightforward criteria. So I have no problem with artists who have left Russia and who have come out against the war publicly to allow them to continue to conduct their work in the West. I think that's just fine. I think outside the cultural sphere, much more importantly, and this we get back to the previous point, there is the whole question of denying Russia strategic resources. Culture is soft power, but it's a very, very small part of, let's say, strategic resources. And Russia has completely lost its soft power anyways. So I would say whether, we affect Russian soft power through sanctions has an insignificant impact on the war. What has a much more significant impact is human resources. And I'll just give you one example, IT workers. At one point at the beginning of the war, and then during the mobilization last September, it was estimated that up to 120,000 IT workers left Russia. That's a colossal number of very trained, very qualified people. Many of these people were not necessarily good people who opposed the war on principle. Many of them were just scared of being drafted and sent to the front. But objectively, these people are a resource for Russia. If they're in Russia, they contribute to the war effort at every level. They work for defense industries. They work for peripheral industries that contribute to the defense industry. They work for banks that contribute to the defense industry. In my mind, it was important that people like that be allowed to stay in Europe, even if have not left for principled reasons, simply because they are a resource for the Russian state. And unfortunately, because the West would not give a lot of these people visas, many of them have gone back. Possibly 80,000 have gone back. So it's like practically we gave these people back to Russia to help their war efforts by refusing to accept them, in the West. And I think that's a mistake, because we should really be thinking very pragmatically and cynically in terms of what can we do to deny resources to the Russian war machine. And humans are a resource.
Pragmatically speaking, they could be mobilized as well.
But they're much more valuable to Russia as IT specialists than as, cannon fodder in Bakhmut, obviously. Sure. Russia needs IT above all for their drones, for everything, for all their systems. So by sending these people back to Russia, we're just like gifting these human resources back to the regime. And I think that's really a shame. We should have been thinking about things like that. And IT, I'm just giving one example. There are many, many other sectors where you can make similar arguments.
Going back to Chechnya and Syria, I've been speaking to many Chechens and Syrians over this year. Many of them feel that what is happening in Ukraine, it's a certain point in history where interest about the events in Chechnya and in Syria may come, and it could be, used in some way, maybe to, again, as a chance and hope for justice for some Chechens and Syrians. I don't know if it's going to work, if it may work, legally speaking, but what do you think, after what you've seen in Chechnya and in Syria and Georgia? Do you think that seeking justice for what the Russians have done in Ukraine may bring also justice for some cases, I don't know, for some people like Surovikin, for example, for what they've done in other countries in Chechnya and Syria as well?
Honestly, I doubt it, just out of natural pessimism. The West wrote off Chechnya, the West wrote off Syria completely. And I don't think they're going to reopen these dossiers anytime soon. There have been ongoing efforts to pursue justice, especially in the case of Syria. through universal jurisdiction mechanisms. So some Syrian torturers and murderers have been arrested and put on trial in Germany and in France. And I think this is very good. But I mean, we have to be honest. These are very small level people, colonels or whatever at best. For some reason, due to the mechanisms and the way the legal mechanisms work, the ICC cannot work on Syria because it's blocked by Russia, the Security Council. So there's not going to be any overall jurisdiction. There's zero momentum for creating a special jurisdiction, even less momentum than there is in Ukraine. We see how hard it is to get the idea of a special jurisdiction together for Ukraine. For Syria, we can forget it. So, no, I'm quite pessimistic. Hopefully one day the Bashar regime will collapse and there will be a very rough form of justice meted out locally, which probably won't be terribly resemble something we'd call justice, but, might provide some consolation to the victims.
What about Chechnya? Is there, there's nobody in the world who would step up for these people and for what happened to them?
Chechnya is closed. Chechnya is forgotten. Chechnya is the past, especially since, Russia has managed to co-opt a great majority of the surviving field commanders and boyviks. They're all now part of the Ranzam Kadyrov regime, so they've gone on the bad side, let's say, and the others are dead. So, I mean, there really is no one left to call for justice and to call for accountability for what was done in the two wars. I think the most likely scenario in Chechnya is that when Putin dies, there'll be a third Chechen war, even possibly more violent than the previous two, and then we'll see.
Why do you think Putin was successful in Chechnya?
Putin was successful because he changed the strategy. In the first war, they used old communist strategy of co-opting, a certain part of the elite, but they went for the wrong people. They went for the former communist leader, Doko Zavgayev, who was the head of, Communist Party before 1991 in Chechnya. They worked through the Naqshbandi Sufi networks because that's what they were already doing in Dagestan, and they felt that these were more reliable religious networks than because most of the rebels are Vids associated with the Kadiri, which is the other major group of Sufis, let's say, in Chechnya. There's Naqshbandi and there's Kadiri. So they were trying to create a sort of civil war situation where on one side you had pro-Russian, more Naqshbandi-leaning fighters, and on the other side you had, the rebels who were tended to be more Kadiri. In the second war, Putin, I'm sure it's not his personal idea. It was very much analysis from the Academy of Science, people like Trenin, and also, of course, Surkov came up with the strategy of what they called Chechenization, which really wasn't Chechenization any more than supporting the other Chechens in the First War was. It's just they decided to support different Chechens, so to actually support rebels and former rebels and co-opt them, buy them, basically, and bring them to their side. And they made the choice of working with Kadyrov's father, Ahmed Haji, who, because of all his conflicts with the Wahhabis, the so-called Wahhabis, and what he perceived as Maskhadov's weakness in fighting the Wahhabis, was really, really pissed off at the whole general, let's say, nationalist rebel movement. And so he accepted to go over to the Russian side. Very much, I think, in his case, I knew Ahmed Haji a little bit. I worked with him, as a humanitarian aid worker. He was our interlocutor as the head of the administration. So we had meetings with him. We discussed with him. I think he saw himself very much as a patriot, as someone who was doing this to save Chechnya from total destruction, to save the Chechen people from total destruction, and that by switching sides, he was protecting his people. I think that was his mindset when he made the choice to go over to the Russian side. And certainly that's what he was selling to a lot of the field commanders that he brought over with him. So they completely changed the strategy. They went for co-opting rebels and co-opting Kadiri muftis, Kadiri Sufi networks. And that's what worked, because that represented the majority of what constituted the rebel movement.
Yeah, but creating the situation of possibility of total destruction in the first place, and then co-opting and making them do this choice, some of them, probably is also part of the tactics, right?
Possibly, but I think also it was, very much a change of strategy at one point, because they realized that they went for Chechenization only in 2001. They'd already been fighting for a year and a half and getting absolutely nowhere. I mean, they were having concrete military victories on the ground, but the insurgency was just constantly going on and attacking them. And they realized this would be beskonyechny. It would just be, forever without end. And so by allying with some of their opponents, that was a major change of strategy. Obviously, they didn't expect Kadyrov, the father, to be killed so quickly. And then, I don't know if you remember, there was a 3-year hiatus because Ramzan was too young when his father was killed to be president. So there was a man who took the interim position for 3 years until Ramzan reached 30, and then Ramzan was made president in 2006, I think. But there's a lot of other components to the strategy which I found very interesting and which I talked about even back in 2009 in my book, which was it wasn't just a political Chechenization. In other words, it wasn't just co-opting these rebel commanders and their men. There was also something about changing the way Chechen society worked. And I don't know where they got the analysis that was sophisticated enough to understand this and to do this, but I really saw it at work. They deliberately set out to undermine what made Chechens Chechens. Chechen society is an incredibly archaic society which lives according to sets of very, very ancient rules and codes of conduct, some of which we can find, absolutely distasteful, like the way they behave towards women, for example, or so forth, but which provides a very incredibly strong structure for the way the society works, and which structured the way the society resisted Russian oppression through these centuries, because really they fought them for a century and a half. And with the youth that was chased out of Chechnya by the war, grew up in camps, in many cases had lost their fathers or their older brothers. In other words, the men who are responsible for the transmission of these values, they started under Ramzan replacing that with a kind of what I would call a neo-traditionalism, so sort of fake Chechenity.
With a fake father figure?
With a fake father figure, with, the whole very Soviet, they would do all these traditional shows, song and dance, but also on a much more concrete level, working through the muftis, working through the virds, the Sufi virds.
So like disrupting families physically, right? Killing getting rid of the part of the...
No, it wasn't that. The fathers and the brothers were just killed because they were fighters and, they were killed in the war. This just happens. But it was more about teaching the young people new rules, new ways of behavior that were altered compared to the old Chechen values. So the old Chechen values were, in many cases, just vanished. And it became they created a syncretism of Islamism, which they claimed to be fighting under the guise of Wahhabism. They actually Islamicized Chechen Islam in a very strong... I saw this very clearly when I went to the mosque in 2009, and I saw how they were praying. They had incorporated a lot of these Islamist, not Islamic, but Islamist values.
Which they never did before.
Because normally Islamism and Sufism are completely antithetical. So they somehow managed to contaminate their Sufism with Islamicism, make it much more radical, and at the same time present this all as a part of the greater, Russian Empire and so forth, and the whole discourse Kadyrov has about, we're glorious Russia and all that, in a very weird way. Much more conservative approach to women, much more conservative than had been previously. For instance, when I first came to Grozny in 1996, women were wearing skirts, see-through shirts. You could see the lace bras under the see-through shirts.
They went to universities.
Most of them
driving cars.
Most of them had their hair out. And, by 2009, they were in completely non-see-through one-piece dresses and wearing headscarves and getting attacked with paintballs if they didn't do that. One thing I found incredibly shocking was that, Ramzan created this morality police that would go out to police women's behavior, women's dress.
Like in Iran.
But this is particularly shocking in Chechnya because one thing that's very much a core value of Chechen society is that only the families are allowed to regulate the behavior of the members of their families. It's absolutely, completely prohibited for someone from outside the family to come and tell a woman how to behave. This can be like a killing offense. And it was in the 90s when I was there. The normal way it would happen is if you, as a Chechen man, saw women that you considered inappropriately dressed, you would have to ask her politely who is her father. And then you would go see the father and you would talk with the father and say, listen, I saw your daughter dressed like this or behaving like this. I think this is not correct. And I propose you do something about it. And then the father could say, you're right, I will do something about it. Or the father could say, fuck off, it's none of your business, it's my daughter. But it's the families that decide. And by creating this morality police, Ramzan completely violated this norm and gave the government the right to interfere with what up to then had only been a family's business. So they entered into each family through these actions. And this, for me, is a very clear example of this destructuration I'm trying to talk about, which is a very complex subject. So it's hard to, especially because there are no studies, obviously, there's no scientific studies on this. Anthropologists have not worked on this. So it's all impressions one gets from spending so much time there. But I think I've seen this process at work quite clearly, and I think it was quite deliberate on the part of the Russians. I always wondered, for instance, if the fact that Surkov is half Chechen has anything to do with this. Maybe he actually understands Chechen society well enough that he could implement these decisions deliberately. But that's just a guess. I have no information about this.
Thanks to you, I had this wonderful chance to look through the really interesting videos by the Russian journalist Andrei Babitsky, who used to work for the Radio Free Liberty in Chechnya for many years. And then later on, he greeted the Crimean annexation and supported the so-called Novorossiya and all that propaganda bullshit that Putin suggested. He died 2 years ago, if not mistaken, in temporary occupied Donetsk. I wanted to talk to you very shortly about the guy and about this case that he had so much trust among the Chechens. He really delivered brilliant pieces of journalism from Chechnya, sometimes being the only voice, from some places and among some people, some places nobody could go. Why do you think this happened? You probably knew him a little bit closer. Do you have any guesses what happened in his head? Does it have anything to do with why the rest or some of other Russian liberals supported the Crimean annexation? Is that about imperialism? What do you think this is about?
I don't have an answer to your question because I never saw Andrei again after he moved to Donbass, to Donetsk. And so I was never able to talk about this with him. Andrei Babitsky was someone in the 90s that we all incredibly admired. I mean, we were just in awe of him, of his courage, of, how far he would go to get footage, information, news. He was absolutely fearless. He would just do things that were completely insane in terms of, physical courage, which got him into a lot of trouble. He was arrested during the Second War, tortured in a filtration camp, handed over to pro-Moscow Chechens, nearly killed. I mean, there were just all kinds of stories. And I met him after that. We became quite good friends, actually, to the point where he trusted me with a full copy of his archive, which I shared with you. So for a while, I was quite close to him. I would go visit him in Prague. He would come visit me in Barcelona. This is the mid-2000s, I would say, after he'd, slowed down in terms of working in Chechnya. Although in 2005 is when he went back to interview Shamil Besayev after Beslan, which was also an absolutely amazing piece of reporting. And as you said, the Chechens trusted him unconditionally. I mean, he was, he had so much respect among the Chechens. What happened between 2005 and 2014, I do not know. We stopped seeing each other. He moved to Donetsk. I never contacted him. I have hypotheses, but they're my personal hypotheses, and they have no basis. So, I don't think it's necessary to share them. I don't think it's possible to extrapolate Andrei's case to the broader Russian intelligentsia. Andrei was an incredibly peculiar man. He had a very peculiar background. He came from Tajikistan with a Tajik father, so a very mixed family. He was quite an exceptional, he's a totally different man from, for instance, someone like Anna Politkovskaya, who was very much a member of the Moscow intelligentsia, une grande dame, as we say in France. Incredibly courageous and incredibly dedicated also, but she would be a much more typical, I would say, representative of
Russian,
especially Moscow, intelligentsia. Andrei was always like a flying saucer. I mean, he's just an extraterrestrial and even the Russians found him, even the good Russian, the people who were also, against the Chechen war or critical of it, found him incredibly weird because he was a strange guy. And I was incredibly sad when he moved to Donetsk. I mean, I could not understand why he just flipped 180 degrees and joined the empire of evil he had been fighting all these years. Something in his head must have made some very weird amalgams, which I cannot understand. Maybe he identified, he felt that the poor Russian speakers of Donetsk were oppressed the same way the Chechens were oppressed, but I don't see how that's possible because he was an intelligent guy. He's not someone who would succumb to these silly stories that the regime was putting out.
I asked this because it seems like for many Ukrainians that a lot of Russians, Russian liberals, Russian journalists, Russian human rights activists somehow still not argue or probably argue the idea of this war, the Ukrainian, resistance as anti-imperialistic resistance. And the moment, when the Russians will understand that this war is not only about the Putin's regime, but also about the Russian empire, and Russian relation to Ukraine as its colony will be a changing moment in the history that many Russians and many Russian liberals do not just understand it at all.
I disagree with you. I think a lot of them do, actually. Last year, for instance, I was invited to Vilnius. They called it the Congress for Free Russia, I think was the name. It was organized by Khodorkovsky and Kasparov. 300 people came from, different branches of the opposition, except for the Navalny people who refused to come because, of course, they can never get along with each other. And Kasparov said it, crystal clear. He said the liberation of Russia will begin when the Ukrainian flag flies on Sebastopol. So, he linked the two incredibly directly. He said, Russia will not be free until Ukraine wins the war. That was his discourse, and I found that incredibly lucid and correct.
Yeah, but at the same time, Khodorkovsky said not once that Kiev or Ukraine is a place where he feels home, because basically peoples are brothers and we're just almost the same people, something like that. I'm not giving you the exact quote, but it was the meaning was very, very, very close.
Let's be honest. Before this war, a huge amount of Ukrainians felt perfectly at home in Moscow and a huge amount of Russians felt perfectly at home in Kiev. And this is just a fact. I've got tons of friends that moved in both directions, worked in both directions. The exchanges were constant. This was all broken apart by the war, but it was a fact. It was a reality. So, of course, a lot of Russians felt perfectly comfortable being in Kiev, hanging out in Ukraine, the same way a huge amount of Ukrainians were working and doing careers in Russia.
You feel that the Russians do really understand this reason why Ukrainians fight and not fight Putin, but fight Russia as the empire that tries to, reestablish its order?
I think a part of the intelligentsia, the opposition, obviously, yeah, of course they do. But, you can't just see the story in terms of Russia and Ukraine. There was this thing called the Soviet Union for 70 years in the middle.
No, of course.
And a lot of these people of the older generation, like Mr. Khodorkovsky and others, were born and raised in the Soviet Union. And so beyond the whole Russian imperial thing, there's also leftovers of a Soviet mentality where, when you grow up for 30 years in one country, obviously that's what it feels like. It feels like one country. Later, you can intellectually understand that actually parts of this country were being oppressed and this and this and that, but you can still feel at home there because it was your home for a good part of your life. This is just the experience a lot of people of the older generation have gone through, which obviously younger people haven't. People like your generation barely knew the Soviet Union. So for you always grew up and lived in an independent Ukraine, which was your own country. But this is not the experience of someone who is twice your age. I was 24 years old when the Soviet Union fell. So if I'd been a Soviet, I would have already finished university in the Soviet Union. I would have been quite Soviet already by this point.
Yeah, but in Ukraine, many people, also your age, they still remember this long journey of fight against Russia, be it Soviet Empire, Russian Empire, and of course...
but it was probably not so obvious to Russians.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not obvious to Russians. Probably my last question, and I really want you to reflect on this. How do you feel about chances of winning Russia, defeating Russia in this war? What is different, the world is doing against Russia this time, if we compare to the times of, Chechnya and Syria? And if you do have hope of the victory, what gives you that hope?
Well, obviously, it's a completely different situation. The entire Western world, Europe and the United States, is supporting Ukraine not just morally, but quite concretely, economically and militarily, with vast amounts of money and vast amounts of weaponry, which never happened in Chechnya, never happened in Syria, never happened in Georgia. And that makes a huge difference because, the reason Ukraine can resist the Russian military-industrial complex is because you have these resources that are given to you. The chances of victory are impossible to predict because they completely depend on that support continuing. If the support continues, I'm convinced Ukraine will win. But if political situations change in America, for instance, in next year's election, and the support is cut off, That's going to make Ukraine's position a lot more fragile, more difficult. So I think, unfortunately, and this is really sad for me, Ukraine's chances of victory are conditioned on external factors that Ukraine does not control, which is, the political developments in Europe and in America. If the support continues at the level it's currently being given, I'm convinced, you will break through to the Black Sea, you will isolate Crimea, you will fragilize the Russian position in Crimea to a point where Crimea will become unsustainable and force Russians to negotiate on terms that will be favorable to Ukraine. If the pipeline of weaponry is cut off, then it's going to be a very difficult situation.
You think this may happen? For what reasons?
Very concretely, it depends on who wins the 2024 election in the United States of America. If it's Trump or another isolationist Republican, it's going to be a huge problem. If it's the Democrats, then everything should be fine. So we have to pray for a Democrat victory in 2024 in the United States.
In my view, it's not only about the external factors, but also about how good we fight and, how united we are and how much we do, because the support also comes to those who are actually fighting.
Yeah, but that's already there in a way.
Sure, it is.
Ukrainian society is completely mobilized, is completely coordinated, is working on every level from activism and volunteers to the soldiers of ZSU to resist collectively. But if you don't have the weapons to do it with, it's as well as I do, it comes down to shells per day and bullets per day. That's what it comes down to. Even now, the Russians are firing 10 to 20,000 shells a day to your 3 or 4 or 5,000 shells a day because you don't have the shells that they have. You don't have the quantity. And this is why the offensive is so slow, because you cannot match their firepower equally. So you can equilibrate that with the more sophisticated weaponry the West is giving you. But that weaponry gets destroyed as the war goes on. New ones have to come all the time. And if you run out of this weaponry, it's going to be a huge problem.
Well, we still hope for the best.
I'm certainly hoping.
And we still think that we should hope as not just, something as an idea. We should work for this hope to work. We should do everything possible.
I think Ukraine is obviously clearly, the government is anticipating these scenarios and is trying to diversify its sources of procurement, is trying to build up its own weapon industry as much as possible. But these are processes that take years and years and years and years. It's very difficult. It's terrible to say this, that it's, that Ukraine is that dependent on things like an election in America. But I think right now it's the concrete factor that, for instance, Putin is counting on. Putin is trying to hold till November of 2024 to see who wins and will adjust his strategy in function of whoever wins the American election. That's very much part of his calculation because, all the will, the Chechens had an incredible will to fight, for example. I've never seen such a will to fight. But, what could 20,000 guys with Kalashnikovs and RPGs do against the Russian army? In fine, they resisted for many years and they were eventually crushed. Because if you don't have weaponry that can match your enemy's weaponry, that's what happens.
I think in one of your texts you said that even seeing what Putin has done and has not done, has not succeeded in Ukraine to the level he was planning to, obviously, that the West is still afraid of him. Do you still think so? Is the West still afraid of the, nuclear power?
Yes, unfortunately, that I think is a huge mistake that we're making. Anne Applebaum just wrote yesterday a piece about this in The Atlantic. She was talking about Elon Musk and Elon Musk freaking out because of Russia's nuclear threats and cutting off the Starlinks over Crimea. And then she pointed out that 2 months later, Ukraine's found another way to attack Sevastopol without Starlink and blew up some ships in the Bay of Sebastopol, and there was no nuclear war. So, clearly this is Russian bluffing. Obviously, they're constantly agitating this bluff of nuclear war, and it does scare a lot of people. Because Russians are very good at that, at scaring people. That's part of their strategy. And
is that generational, you think? Those who still remember what nuclear think what nuclear war could be about?
But I think also it comes from a lack of understanding of the Russians. In France, for instance, clearly they understand the Russians very, very badly. Macron is constantly banging on about, discussing with Putin. By now he should understand you cannot discuss with these people. You can only threaten them more than they're threatening you. Putin is a man, he is a rational man. He is a man who thinks in terms of relationships of power and that the strongest one wins. So if you can instaure a relation with him where you demonstrate that you are more powerful and that you will whack him, then he will back off. If you show yourself to be weak, then he will take advantage of that and exploit it by making more threats, by advancing, by testing, by He's constantly looking for weaknesses. This is what he does all the time. With Poland, with the Balts, with America, with France, with Germany, threatening, trying things. And the only way to counter that is to do what Ukraine is doing, which is fight him and beat him on the ground, militarily, face to face, and go, no, actually, we're stronger than you, so fuck off. That language is actually language he understands quite well and will respond to. So if he's beaten militarily, he will draw the conclusions. He will not go and destroy the entire planet for his Crimean vanity project. It just doesn't work that way.
Hopefully your words will be heard. I think it's a perfect note to finish our conversation.
Inshallah, as they say in Chechnya.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you for the time.